The morning air was thick with the damp chill of a world on the brink of destruction. War had ravaged every corner of Europe, leaving cities in ruins and landscapes barren. The slow, rhythmic thud of boots against the earth echoed through the quiet as a group of prisoners, captured German soldiers, marched with exhaustion etched into their every step. Their faces, once filled with the youthful vigor of soldiers sent to conquer, were now hollow with hunger, fear, and an overwhelming sense of defeat. Their eyes, dull and empty, flickered only with the faintest glimmer of fear as they shuffled along under the watch of British captors. The men had been on the move for days. Starved, deprived of sleep, and under constant guard, they barely had the energy to keep their feet moving. Their bodies trembled from the cold, their uniforms in tatters, clinging to their emaciated forms like the last remnants of their former selves. Each step seemed more like a stumble, as though they were inching towards some inevitable end. Some of the men walked with their heads down, too tired and broken to look up, while others dared to glance at the British soldiers that marched beside them, each with their rifles slung over their shoulders, their faces impassive and cold. The prisoners' minds raced with the worst possibilities. They had heard the stories, the rumors, the whispers of what awaited those who were captured by the British forces. Interrogations, beatings, perhaps even death. None of them knew what was in store for them. All they knew was that they were no longer fighting for their country. They were fighting merely to survive, hoping for something, anything, that could grant them the slightest chance of making it out alive. The road they walked felt endless, stretching before them like a long, dark tunnel with no light at the end. Every now and then, one of the British soldiers would shout an order, snapping the prisoners back to attention. Their faces remained impassive, but the tension in their bodies was unmistakable. There was no more energy for defiance. The fight had long since drained from them, replaced by the cold, numbing weight of resignation. As they trudged along, the prisoners' minds turned inward, replaying the endless days of battle and violence that had led them to this point. They remembered the sound of artillery shells exploding in the distance, the deafening roar of tank engines, the smell of blood and smoke. They thought of their comrades, those who had fallen, those who were still out there, fighting and dying. They wondered if they would ever see their families again. And in the back of their minds, they knew the real enemy was not just the British soldiers who guarded them, but the war itself, the war that had taken everything from them. The journey was long and wearying, the landscape passing by in a blur of desolation. They marched through barren fields where the remnants of bombed-out villages lay scattered in pieces, silent witnesses to the devastation that had gripped the land. In the distance, the faint hum of artillery fire could still be heard, a constant reminder that, while this particular skirmish was over, the war was far from won. The prisoners had heard rumors that the British forces were closing in on the last pockets of resistance, and yet, for them, the war had already ended. They had lost everything: family, country, honor. All that remained was survival, and even that seemed increasingly uncertain. As they entered the outskirts of a small, war-weary village, the men began to feel a sense of foreboding. The buildings here were less destroyed, but the air was thick with the smell of burning wood and rust. It was a strange, hollow quiet that enveloped the village, broken only by the occasional sound of a dog barking or the distant whistle of a shell. The soldiers leading the prisoners were wary but determined. They had seen enough to know that even in places like this, where hope seemed to have vanished, there was still danger. The villagers were used to soldiers passing through, but no one ever knew which way the wind would blow. The British captors kept their distance, their rifles aimed warily at the prisoners as they marched through the narrow, cobblestone streets. There was no cheering, no celebration of their victory. No one on the street spoke. It was as if the village itself had surrendered long before the soldiers had arrived, too weary from the years of occupation to resist any longer. The prisoners' steps grew heavier as they walked past rows of boarded-up houses, where only the ghosts of what had once been could be felt. Even the trees had started to die, their once lush branches now barren and twisted. The prisoners' breath came in ragged gasps as they neared the village's center. There, in the shadow of a small church, they were herded into a room. It was a modest building, nothing more than a simple structure made of stone and wood, but to the prisoners, it was the most terrifying place they had ever seen. They had no idea what awaited them behind the thick, creaking door. The only sound was the soft clink of their shackles as they moved toward the entrance. They expected harsh words, perhaps blows, and the chill of metal against their skin as the soldiers ordered them to kneel or stand in line. With each step toward the door, the prisoners' hearts beat faster. The dread grew, a heavy presence that settled over their shoulders like an unseen weight. Their minds raced through every possible scenario, none of them good. They had been trained to face the worst in combat, but nothing could have prepared them for this feeling of helplessness, of waiting for something they could not control. All they could do was move forward, one step at a time, like animals led to slaughter. The door creaked open slowly, and the prisoners were ushered into the room. It was small, plain, and dimly lit by a single overhead bulb. The walls were bare, and the floor was cold underfoot. There was a wooden table in the center, surrounded by a few chairs, and at the far end of the room stood a tall, austere figure. A British officer, tall, with the sharp features of a man accustomed to command, stood behind the table. His uniform was crisp, immaculate, as though he had not been in a battlefield for days, as though he had never seen the chaos and carnage these men had lived through. The prisoners stood in line, shoulders slumped, waiting for their fate. The air seemed to thicken with tension, the silence between them and the officer almost suffocating. Each man's eyes were fixed on the captain, and the weight of expectation bore down on them like a hammer. The officers who had escorted them here had said nothing, their faces unreadable. It was as if they, too, knew what was coming and were bracing themselves for the inevitable violence. But there was no sound of weapons being drawn, no commands to kneel, no angry shouts. Instead, the officer behind the table simply stood there, surveying them. The prisoners exchanged glances, their fear deepening. They could feel it now, that creeping certainty, this would not end well. Yet as the officer made no move to speak or even acknowledge their presence, their minds began to race once more, unsure of how to interpret this eerie silence. There was something unsettling in the calmness of the moment, something that cut through their fear and left them with an unfamiliar unease. They had expected cruelty, punishment, or perhaps death. But this stillness was foreign, unsettling in its own way. They waited, trembling, for the storm that they were certain was coming. But instead, they remained locked in this quiet, suspended in time, as though the room itself was holding its breath. The door closed behind them with a soft, but final, thud. The faint echo reverberated in the small, oppressive room, leaving the prisoners alone with their uncertainty. A bitter silence filled the air as the last of the British soldiers who had escorted them stepped back into the hallway, leaving only the captives and the looming officer behind the table. It was a silence that felt unnatural, almost suffocating, as if the weight of the world was pressing down upon them from all sides. The prisoners, exhausted and trembling from their ordeal, stood motionless, eyes locked on the officer who remained still, his hands folded calmly on the table in front of him. The men could hardly believe they were here. Just moments ago, they had been stumbling through the streets of the village, their minds clouded with the horrors of war, their bodies battered and broken. Now, standing in this nondescript room, they were confronted by a strange, almost unbearable stillness. The officer did not move, he did not speak. His presence seemed at odds with everything they had come to expect from the enemy. There was no immediate violence, no harsh words, no barking orders. There was only the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall, the subtle sounds of breath being drawn and released, and the muted whispers of fear that passed between the prisoners. For a long while, no one dared to break the silence. The room was cold, and the dampness in the air seemed to seep into their bones, but it was not the chill that held them captive. It was something far deeper. The prisoners, each a man with a story, with memories, with hopes and fears of his own, stood in a kind of shared paralysis, their bodies frozen and their minds racing. Every inch of their being screamed for action, for movement, for some sign of what was to come. But the officer stood perfectly still, observing them with a gaze that was both detached and intense, as though he were seeing not just the men before him but the entire war in their faces, their souls. One of the prisoners, a tall man with the hollow eyes of a veteran who had seen too much, shifted slightly on his feet, his boots scraping softly against the stone floor. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but to the others, it was as if the entire room had suddenly been jolted. They all turned their gaze to the man, their eyes wide with silent terror. What if this was it? What if this was the moment they had all been waiting for, the moment when their fate would be sealed? Was this the moment when their lives, reduced to the desperate struggle for survival in a world torn apart by war, would come to an end? But still, the officer did nothing. His eyes remained fixed on them, calm and calculating, his face an impassive mask. His presence seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, as if the weight of all that had transpired in the war, all the bloodshed, all the suffering, was pressing down upon them too. The tension in the room became palpable, thickening the air until it felt as though they were suffocating in it. The prisoners' breaths came in shallow, nervous gasps, and their hands, still bound by rough rope, trembled with the strain of holding still. It was as if time itself had slowed, each second stretching into an eternity, each passing moment filled with the possibility of violence, of death. The man who had shifted on his feet cleared his throat, his voice low, barely a whisper. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The question hung in the air, unanswered, but it was a question that all of them were thinking, a question that, despite their terror, none of them could bring themselves to voice. What would happen now? What could they possibly expect from this strange, quiet officer who seemed to have no intention of giving them what they feared most? There was no immediate response from the officer. He simply continued to watch them with the same steady, unblinking gaze, his face betraying no emotion. His silence, in itself, was a kind of answer. The men had expected cruelty, expected punishment, expected brutality. They had prepared themselves for the worst that the British could dish out, and perhaps worse still, the cold, indifferent cruelty that had often marked the face of war. But this silence was different. It was unnerving, more so than any threat or accusation could ever be. It was a stillness that spoke volumes, that held them captive in its grip, forcing them to confront the very essence of their situation. As the minutes dragged on, the men began to shift nervously. The raw, primitive urge to break the silence, to scream, to shout, to demand action, began to build within them. They could feel their bodies tightening, each muscle wound up like a spring ready to snap. The quiet, which had once felt like a reprieve, began to feel more like a trap. The room, with its bare walls and flickering light, seemed to close in around them, each prisoner trapped in his own thoughts, in his own growing fear. How much longer would they have to wait? What was the officer thinking? Did he know they were all already broken inside? Or was he simply playing with them, toying with their minds in the way that only those who had long since given up on mercy could? The man who had spoken earlier, an older prisoner with the weary eyes of someone who had seen far too much death, glanced around at his comrades. He could see it in their faces, the fear, the confusion, the desperation. His heart tightened, but he could not bring himself to say anything more. Instead, he turned his eyes back to the officer, studying him carefully, looking for some hint, some flicker of humanity in the man's expression. But there was nothing. The officer's face remained as inscrutable as ever. And then, just when it seemed that the room could not grow any more suffocating, the officer finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from his chair, the soft scrape of wood against stone filling the room. The prisoners stiffened, their hearts leaping in their chests, expecting the worst. But instead of the harsh command they had braced themselves for, the officer turned toward the back of the room, where a small wooden shelf stood against the wall. He reached up and, with a measured calmness, took down a kettle, placing it on a nearby stove. The prisoners stared in disbelief, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. The officer, this British soldier who had been poised, ready to deliver whatever punishment they feared most, was preparing to make tea. The sound of water being poured into the kettle broke the silence, and for the first time since they had entered the room, the prisoners could hear something besides their own ragged breathing. There was no mistaking it. This was not what they had expected. None of them knew what to do with this new reality, this new, unexpected turn of events. They had been ready to face brutality, to meet their fate with the kind of cold resignation that only soldiers accustomed to war could feel. But this was something entirely different. The officer moved with a kind of deliberation that made the moment all the more surreal. The soldiers' hands, gripped tightly around their ropes, were now trembling with a different kind of tension, a tension born not from fear of violence, but from the crushing weight of confusion. They exchanged furtive glances. Some of the prisoners began to question if they had misunderstood the situation entirely. Could it be that they had been wrong about their captors all along? Could it be that the British officer before them, this man who had taken the role of their captor, was not a monster, but simply another man caught in the web of war? Was this some kind of psychological warfare, a way to disarm them with kindness before the real punishment came? Or was this officer, who had offered them a moment of humanity in a world that had stripped away every semblance of it, something else entirely? The room remained still, each man caught in the uneasy silence of the moment. And as the kettle began to whistle, the officer looked up, his eyes meeting theirs, and for a fleeting second, there was something in his gaze, something that almost resembled understanding. The sound of the kettle's whistling filled the room with an eerie sense of disorientation, a contrast to the heavy silence that had been suffocating the prisoners only moments before. For a long, lingering second, nothing moved, no one breathed, as if time itself had decided to pause and watch. The men stood, uncertain, frozen in place, unable to fully grasp what was happening in front of them. Their minds were still trapped in the confusion of the moment, unable to reconcile the figure of the officer calmly preparing tea with the grim expectations they had carried into this room just moments earlier. The officer moved with practiced ease, reaching for a small tin of tea leaves on the shelf, his fingers steady and deliberate. He poured a measure into the teapot, his every action executed with a care that seemed completely at odds with the chaos of war. The prisoners, their ropes still binding them, shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between one another and the officer. The room felt suffocating, heavy with an atmosphere they couldn't quite understand. It was as if the very air had thickened with the tension of an unspoken question that none of them dared to ask. Why? For the prisoners, there were so many layers to the confusion. They had been trained for the violence of war, had been taught to expect the brutality of their captors, and had made peace with the possibility of torture, interrogation, or worse. They were soldiers, after all, and in this brutal conflict, they knew better than anyone how the enemy treated those who had fallen into their hands. Their minds had prepared them for the worst. They had prepared for cruelty. But this was something else entirely. The officer, noticing their hesitant stares, seemed unfazed. His movements continued with the same calm efficiency, as though making tea for a room full of prisoners was the most ordinary thing in the world. His hands were steady, his posture relaxed, his face impassive. And yet, despite the stillness of his expression, there was a quiet energy in the room, an energy that was hard to define. It was as if the mere act of making tea had become a small ritual, one that slowly began to shift the dynamics of power in the room. The men who had entered moments earlier, full of fear and dread, suddenly found themselves unsure of their roles. They were prisoners, yes, but were they to be treated as such, or were they something else entirely in the eyes of this officer? A prisoner at the back of the group shifted again, his eyes never leaving the officer's steady hands. He had been silent up until now, his face a mask of grim resignation, but his mind was racing. What was this? Was this part of some psychological game? A method of disorienting them before the real brutality began? Or was it something more? Something less violent, perhaps? His throat tightened, and he swallowed hard, the dryness in his mouth impossible to ignore. Could they trust this moment of kindness, or was it a trap? The officer, oblivious to the internal turmoil playing out across the faces of his prisoners, turned toward the small stove and carefully poured the hot water into the teapot. He moved deliberately, with a sense of routine, as though making tea in this exact moment, under these exact circumstances, was not unusual at all. The steam rose from the pot, filling the room with the scent of brewing tea, something so familiar, so domestic, that it was almost jarring against the backdrop of war. The smell, gentle and inviting, was a sharp contrast to the acrid stench of gunpowder and blood that had become so familiar to the men in their time on the front lines. It was a smell that seemed to pull them from the horrors of their past, momentarily offering them a glimpse of something soft, something human, something they had long since abandoned. The officer reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small tin of sugar and a simple, well-worn metal spoon. His actions were methodical, almost soothing, as he prepared the tea with an expertise that spoke to years of making the same ritual over and over. To the prisoners, it was as if the world had suddenly shifted on its axis, leaving them disoriented, caught between the violence they had known and the unexpected calm they were now facing. The officer moved without urgency, his steps unhurried, his demeanor almost kind. His calmness seemed to amplify the confusion in the room, as if it was something they were not meant to understand. The men exchanged glances, their eyes wide with disbelief. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, while others stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. Was it possible that they had misunderstood the situation entirely? Was this officer playing some kind of cruel joke on them, making them believe for a brief moment that there was something other than war? Some part of their minds, the part trained for survival, screamed at them to resist, to question everything, to stay on guard. But another part, a part that had been buried under the weight of their uniforms and their roles as soldiers, longed for the comfort that this simple act of making tea seemed to offer. It was as though the world, in its twisted chaos, had offered them this small sliver of peace, something they had almost forgotten existed. The officer, now standing before them with a tray of steaming mugs, glanced at the prisoners. His gaze was steady, but there was no malice in it, no sign of the cruelty they had braced for. It was a look that conveyed nothing but quiet certainty, as if he were merely offering them something as natural as breathing. Without a word, he placed a mug in front of each of them. The mugs were simple, unadorned, but they felt like treasures in the hands of the prisoners, their warmth seeping through their trembling fingers. The prisoners stared down at the mugs, unsure of how to proceed, as if touching the cups could somehow alter the course of their fates. The steam rose from the mugs in swirling tendrils, carrying with it the comforting aroma of tea, the sweetness of sugar blending with the earthy scent of the leaves. For a moment, no one moved. The prisoners stood in their bonds, staring down at the mugs as if they were foreign objects, as if the very act of drinking from them might somehow betray their understanding of the situation. They had been trained to survive, to resist, to endure the worst of what war had to offer. But now, faced with this simple gesture of humanity, they felt a deep unease, a sense that something had shifted in the room, in the world, that they could not quite comprehend. One of the prisoners, a younger man who had been silent up until now, slowly reached for the mug in front of him. His hand shook slightly as he grasped the handle, the warmth of the porcelain surprising against the chill of the room. His eyes flickered toward the officer, who stood silently watching him. The officer's gaze was calm, steady, but there was something else in it, something the prisoner could not place. It was not kindness, nor pity, but something more elusive. Understanding, perhaps. The younger man lifted the mug to his lips, the hot liquid touching his mouth. The tea was not extravagant, not a luxury, but it was more than enough to remind him of something he had forgotten. A taste of normalcy, a taste of peace, a taste of home. As he drank, the others followed suit. The act was slow, tentative, as if the very motion of sipping from the mug was fraught with meaning. It was almost as if they were being asked to reconsider everything they had known, to confront their assumptions about who they were and who their captors were. In the space of this quiet moment, it seemed as if everything was suspended: time, expectation, fear. And as each prisoner took a sip, the room filled with a soft, unspoken understanding. The tea was not just a drink, it was a bridge. It was a link between them and the world they had almost forgotten, the world where things like tea, shared moments, and simple human kindness still had meaning. The officer watched them silently, his posture relaxed, but his eyes never leaving the men. They were no longer just prisoners, no longer just captives bound by the cruelty of war. In that moment, they were men again, bound by something deeper, something older than the uniform they wore or the guns they carried. They were human beings, sitting together, sharing something as simple and as profound as a cup of tea. And as the steam from the mugs swirled in the air, a strange quiet settled over the room, one that was not filled with dread, but with something far more powerful, the quiet hum of shared humanity. The room had shifted. No one could deny it. The very air had transformed, as if the walls themselves had exhaled a breath they didn't even know they had been holding. It was not just the tea that had altered the space, though it played its part, its warmth, its simplicity, but something more profound had taken place, something that could not be measured by the physical. The prisoners had entered this room moments before with clenched hearts, their minds filled with fear, their bodies conditioned to expect the worst from their captors. They had been ready for pain, for violence, for death, but instead, they had been met with this strange, unsettling calm. This act of normalcy. And now, the unsettling silence that had fallen over them seemed to stretch in every direction, enveloping them as though they were caught in some thick, unseen fog. For the men who had just a short time ago been on the brink of despair, the transition was difficult to comprehend. They had seen what war had made of people. They had been there, on the front lines, amidst the chaos, the slaughter, and the madness. There was no kindness in war, no time for reflection, no space for humanity to breathe. Everything they had learned in battle told them to distrust, to remain alert, to never let their guard down. But this was different. This officer, standing before them with his calm demeanor, his small gestures of care, was asking them to unlearn everything they had been taught. He was asking them to take a moment, just a moment, and to recognize something deeper within themselves. The men, still bound, stood frozen in their places, the warmth of the tea still radiating through their fingers, but the rest of them was stiff, as if caught between two worlds. Their instinct to resist, to remain on alert, fought with the part of them that longed to let go, to forget the brutality of the war, to feel something other than the constant ache of fear. And in the space of that hesitation, the silence stretched again, longer this time, more potent. The officer watched them without a word, his expression neither kind nor cruel but something else entirely, something that seemed to acknowledge their internal struggle. He said nothing, made no move to force their participation in whatever this moment was. He simply stood there, waiting. The air grew heavier still, not with menace but with expectation. It was as though time itself had folded into this moment, this single instant where the past and future collided. The prisoners, who had been trained to expect only suffering from those who held them captive, found themselves confused by this silence, by the lack of immediate punishment. Their hearts pounded in their chests, their breathing shallow. And yet, for the first time in what felt like years, there was a faint flicker of something else, a small, tentative spark of hope. A hope they had not realized they still carried, buried deep beneath the layers of trauma, anger, and resignation. One of the prisoners, an older man who had long since lost any semblance of youth in the brutality of the war, was the first to break the silence. He raised the mug of tea slowly, with deliberate care, as though the action itself was a momentous decision. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he brought the cup to his lips. He hesitated before taking a sip, his eyes not leaving the officer for even a second. The officer stood silent, his face unreadable, but there was a slight shift in his posture, something that might have been recognition. The man took the sip, and then another. His eyes fluttered closed for just a moment, as if savoring the warmth, the taste. For a brief, fleeting moment he was transported, not to the battlefields, not to the horrors he had endured, but to a time long ago, before the war had stripped everything from him. It was a moment of comfort, a moment of stillness. The other prisoners watched him, their eyes wide, their bodies tense, uncertain of how to react. Was this a test? Would the officers spring some trap upon them once they let their guard down? Or was this just a human gesture, one that could not be calculated or twisted into something else? The young man who stood closest to the older soldier, the one who had never spoken since entering the room, swallowed hard and followed the older man's example. His movements were unsure, but he reached out for the mug and lifted it carefully to his lips. The warmth of the liquid felt almost too much, too foreign, too gentle, against the constant cold that had gripped him for so long. His hands shook slightly, but he drank. And then, after a pause, he drank again. The cup felt lighter in his hands now, as though it carried not just the weight of the tea but something more, something intangible but undeniable. Something that had been lost to him in the maelstrom of war. The officer watched them both, but he did not rush them. He did not offer any words of encouragement or instruction. He stood by the table, his eyes calm, almost distant, as though he were merely a witness to this small exchange between them. But it was clear that he was not a passive figure in this moment. He had begun something with the simple act of making tea, and now, by remaining silent, by allowing the prisoners to move at their own pace, he was subtly giving them permission to reclaim something of themselves they had long since forgotten. He was offering them the choice to lay down their fear, if only for a moment, and to embrace the frailty of being human. To acknowledge that even in the most brutal of circumstances, moments of tenderness and normalcy could still exist. The older man, who had initially taken the first sip, looked at the others, his eyes softer now, as though some heavy weight had lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, he could see them, not as faceless enemies, not as mere shadows of soldiers, but as people, each struggling with the same hunger, the same fear, the same longing for something other than war. He took another sip of his tea, his lips curving upwards slightly. He glanced around at the others. One by one, the men began to follow his lead. Some took their first sip tentatively, as though unsure of whether they deserved it, while others drank deeply, almost greedily, as if they had never tasted anything so sweet, so pure. The officer stood by the table, his posture relaxed but alert. He did not speak, and yet his presence seemed to invite something in the prisoners, an invitation to be more than just soldiers, more than just captives. To be men again, if only for a brief moment. The room, still small and dimly lit, felt expansive now. The weight of the outside world, the war, the violence, the destruction, seemed to recede. Here, in this room, time had momentarily suspended itself, and the prisoners found themselves tasting not just the tea but something else, something deeper. A shared moment of humanity, a recognition that beyond the uniforms and the weapons and the chains, they were all just men. Men who had suffered, who had lost, who had endured. But in that moment, they were not just prisoners. They were not enemies. They were human beings, sitting together in a small, quiet room, sharing a drink that had, for the briefest of moments, managed to restore some semblance of peace to their souls. The officer, still silent, continued to watch them. It was as though he understood that in this small, seemingly insignificant gesture, something far more profound was happening. Something that could not be rushed, something that needed to be felt in silence. He did not need to speak. He did not need to explain himself. His actions, small and simple as they were, had already communicated everything that needed to be said. The prisoners, caught in the strange gravity of the moment, began to settle. The tension, though still present, began to ease, if only slightly. The room, once filled with the weight of their fears, now felt lighter, as if the air itself had been cleared. They drank in silence, their eyes occasionally meeting, acknowledging the unspoken understanding between them. The officer remained where he stood, watching them, but his gaze had softened, just a fraction. He, too, had momentarily stepped away from the role he had been cast into. He was no longer just a soldier of war. In this quiet room, he was a man sharing a moment with other men. Men who, though once enemies, had been brought together by something as simple as a cup of tea. And in that moment, amidst the heavy quiet, something irreversible had shifted. The war, the violence, the divisions that separated them seemed distant, far away, as if they were all suddenly part of something larger, something that transcended the brutality of their roles as soldiers. The tea, once a simple act of human connection, had transformed into a quiet ritual, one that was gradually weaving its own kind of narrative among the prisoners and their captor. Each sip taken by the men was a moment that seemed to push them farther away from the world they had come from, a world of bloodshed and violence, of enemies and allies divided by uniforms and ideologies. The warmth of the tea seemed to act as an antidote to the bitterness of their circumstances, an unexpected reminder that even in the darkest of times, the simplest gestures could bring a glimmer of light. As the prisoners sat, slowly sipping their tea, the room settled into a kind of uneasy tranquility. Their initial hesitation had faded, replaced by an almost reverent silence. The steaming mugs were clutched tightly in their hands, the heat a comfort against the chill of the room. They had been bound not just by ropes but by fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of what they had expected would happen to them here. But as the minutes stretched on, that fear began to shift, began to fracture in small, almost imperceptible ways. They were no longer just soldiers at war, reduced to mere tools of the conflict. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were simply men, each of them connected by the shared act of drinking tea. Some of the prisoners began to glance around the room, their eyes lingering on each other, meeting one another's gaze as if they were seeing each other for the first time. There was no need for words, not yet. The silence between them had transformed into something far more profound. It was a silence that invited introspection, a silence that allowed them to shed the hardened exteriors of soldiers and reveal, if only for a brief moment, the vulnerability that lay beneath. They looked at one another as if trying to recall who they were before the war, trying to remember what it felt like to be more than just a soldier. Their faces, once stoic and guarded, softened as they slowly allowed themselves to experience the tea, the small comfort it offered, in full.